I'm Eva, and I'm here with my co-host Thistle for another episode of The Charm of It, a knitting podcast for those who share my fascination with the nitty-gritty details of our craft. This is going to be another Project Snapshot episode. Usually I'm alternating between them, but due to health issues and life issues, I'm behind on recording. So I'm going to do a Project Snapshot now and get that out, and then I'll be able to do a more elaborate episode this weekend. Daylight savings. Ugh, the sun is setting, I think around 4:30 here now, and so that really limits my recording time during the weekdays, and then this past weekend I wouldn't have been able to hold anything up to the camera. I was having a very bad flare-up, so yep, that is why. If you're a returning viewer, it is so nice to see you again. Thank you. And if you're a new viewer, thanks for giving me a try. As I mentioned, I do 2 different types of episodes. So if you're interested in more general knitting talk instead of just lots of project details, you might want to try one of those episodes instead. And you can just see Moth, my kitty co-host. Currently, they're both trying to figure out how they're going to fit in my lap. I am drinking homemade chai today. And I posted the recipe on Instagram. I mean, it's chai, it's not like I invented a magical new method, but just in case, several people were interested. And I will go ahead, I don't do project show notes. I don't do show notes for these episodes. On the next big episode, I will include the graphic that I made with the recipe in case you're not on Instagram and don't want to be. Oh. And I guess I should say now, sorry, I'm a little scatterbrained. Skipping episodes is not good for me, and then I'm trying to get this out even though I'm still not in a great health place, but the world's better than I was this weekend, so I'm very glad for that. As I was going to say, I am The Charm of It on Instagram and Ravelry, and those are the 2 places where I'm most active. Instagram is where I'm most active as far as socializing goes. And you can always find the links to all the stuff on YouTube. I have, the little squares in the video corner, and then I include links in the down bar. I'm a big link person. But yeah, I love to connect with viewers, so feel free to leave comments or drop notes or anything like that. And yeah, I love getting to know you all, so don't be nervous. If you want to get in touch, do so. Okay, so I've got several works in progress. It's been a while, so I can't really remember what I've shown and what I haven't, but I guess I'll alternate between things I know I've shown before and things that I think are going to be new for you, and scratching Thistle's chin. So I finished the back of my Miss Lemon jumper, and I'm so excited because it looks like a proper sweater now. You can see the difference between the part that I blocked to make sure the length was right. Is this the front? No. That is the inside out. Okay, so here it is looking like a proper sweater. And you can see the difference between the bottom half, which I blocked, and the top half, which is unblocked. So that was because I was worried that my gauge might have changed. So I really dislike being worried while I'm knitting. If I think that something's going to go wrong, or I'm hoping that something will block out, I usually just stop knitting and block it and see what happens, because I really just don't like having that little voice in the back of my mind going, oh no, is this not going to work, as I'm knitting away. I like knitting to be a relaxing thing, so I frequently block my works in progress. You do lose a couple days while you're trying to wait for it to dry, which can be frustrating. Although since I knit more than one project at one time, I just work on my other ones instead. But I think it's really worth it for the peace of mind. So, yeah. Since I talked a few episodes ago about neck shaping, I thought I would go ahead and mention I'm using a custom fit pattern for this sweater. It's my first time using custom fit, which is Amy Herzog's website pattern generator, where you can put in your own numbers, like your body measurements, and then you can specify if you prefer like a different length or that kind of thing. You can change those numbers at will before it generates. And you put in your gauge, and then for $10, you get a pattern using just those numbers. So I wanted to go ahead and give it a try, and since I'm knitting this at a gauge of about 11 stitches per inch, I thought this would be an excellent time to try it because I didn't want to have to rip back and fix things the way that I frequently do on my self-designed sweaters, because 11 stitches per inch takes a while. I keep forgetting, obviously if you're a new viewer, you don't know yet, but this is knit out of Knit Pick Shadow Lace, which is 100% merino, and it's the Opal Heather colorway, and I really love it. It's a beautiful colorway. That's probably more accurate, maybe a little darker. And I really like the fabric that I'm getting. I'm knitting the ribbing on 000s and then the body on 0s. I'm a fairly loose knitter. The stitch is just one that I found in Barbara Walker's Stitch Treasury, and you can see a link to how to do it on my project page if you're interested. So, the neck. When I knit sweaters, I always make the center back neck higher than the shoulders because that's just how I prefer things to fit. I don't like things to move around, and I've got a pretty prominent vertebrae back there, and I've had to take various medicine because of my chronic illnesses that might have even made that kind of a bit of a hump. Okay, I realize that I sound like I think I'm a hunchback right now, and I don't think that. I don't know if I can. Okay, some of that. I'm not sure if you can see anything. But the point is, I tend to like my sweaters to come up pretty high in the back. And so I just talked about all the way the different methods that I use in order to do that. And then I got to the neck shaping of this pattern, and it has you bind off and this is the back, not the front. It has you bind off the back neck stitches and then do the shoulder shaping. And I thought, my first thought was, whatever, I'm going to do what I usually do. And then I thought, okay, you bought this custom fit pattern because you're a big fan of Amy Herzog's books, and you think that she's pretty much a sweater knitting genius. And if she's the expert, why are you insisting on doing your own thing instead? So I went ahead and I did it as written. And I figure I can always add short rows to the band if I want it to be higher. But maybe the shoulder shaping is more important than the back of the neck shaping to get a comfortable fit. Because you know how if you're doing a round yoke and you don't do any shaping at all, the sweater kind of chokes you, and you don't want that. So, but I mean, the shoulder shaping alone, I guess, could achieve that. So I'm giving it a try, and I will report back as far as how that goes once I've worn it and stuff. This fabric also has enough potential for blocking that I can probably get a little more length here by blocking. But yeah. So the only other thing I did was I put a locking stitch marker. They're the cordless safety pins. I love them. I think I have like 100 of them that I got off Etsy. Oh well. So I put that in as soon as I started the armhole shaping because I find it kind of tricky sometimes to line up which row. And so if I put a safety pin in the middle when I do the armhole shaping, then it's really easy for me to count rows. The custom fit pattern tells you how many rows you should be knitting, and it also gives directions for length. I really love that it gives directions for rows since the gauge changes pretty dramatically once you block this because you're pinning it. So I'm really enjoying following that pattern, although I'm a little nervous about the neck, but we will see. So I did cast on for the second sleeve of the sweater to try to keep my momentum going because I have not made knitting this a priority. I've just been kind of doing it in the background since the summer, which is silly. Come on. Oh well. As you can see, I'm not very far in it. I was doing well, but then I've been having a lot of neck and shoulder pain. I mean, I always have a lot of neck and shoulder pain, but it has become more acute. There were several days where I couldn't knit at all, which was frightening. And so working on 000s hurts me a little more than working on bigger needles, and doing ribbing hurts a little more than doing plain knitting. So I was listening to my body and trying to take things really easy, and so that's why I have not worked on that in a while. I'm planning to bring that project with me when I go home for Christmas. I go home for like 2.5 weeks, which is quite a bit of time, and most of that time I'm sitting around talking with my family and things. So that's a lot of potential knitting time, and since lace weight yarn doesn't take up much space, you know, this is like 440 yards in this little cake, I thought that it would be a really good travel knitting project. So I think I'll be able to resume working on that soon, though, because I'm feeling a little better. I'm so relieved to be able to knit again. Okay. So the next project is one that I don't think you have seen, and I actually just finished it this morning, but I'm going to talk about it as a work in progress, and then I'll talk about the more finished object stuff on my next episode. But these are a Christmas gift, and so I'm entering them in the Merry Along by Jules of So Sweet Violet, which ends, I think, November 28th. So if you've been knitting Christmas stuff this month, you should go ahead and enter. She's got several prize packages. So I'm calling these my Foxy Loxy socks, and I knit a pair of fox socks earlier this year for myself, and my brother-in-law saw the photo, and his mother really loves foxes, and so he said, oh, would you knit a pair like that for my mother? And usually I would have said no, because I generally prefer to knit for myself or people who I really, really love, and obviously my brother-in-law's mother, not in that inner circle, you know. I mean, I don't know her very well. I've met her. However, last Christmas I gave my brother-in-law just a little hat, a beanie with just little beer steins around the brim. And it was kind of a last minute. I wasn't really sure what he would think about it, and he loved this hat. He was so excited about it. He showed it off to all of his family. He wears this hat all the time, and so he's built up a lot of knitting goodwill for me. And so I said, if you buy the yarn, I will knit the socks, and the hours that I'm spending knitting will be my Christmas gift to you, and then you can go ahead and give the socks to your mother. So that is how I made a second pair of socks. This is also Knit Picks yarn, which is funny because I don't knit with them that frequently. Anyway, this is Stroll Tweed, and the orange is Autumn Heather. It's more muted than it's showing on the camera. And the beige is Oyster Heather. This is my first time knitting with Stroll, and it's quite soft. Probably because it's superwash merino instead of superwash wool. Last year I knit with a skein of Hawthorn, which is another one of their sock yarns, and it was stiff. I did not care for it at all. I have found that it seems like there are two different kinds of superwash yarn. There's the ones that end up being kind of slippery and silky and soft, and then the ones that end up feeling kind of stiff and plasticky. And Stroll definitely falls into the soft category. I'm not sure how it'll wear with the merino and stuff, but my brother-in-law and his family live in South Texas, so it's not as if she is going to, you know, be needing to wear wool socks every day and boots for winter or anything. They're more just for fun. And so the things I wanted to talk about. First of all, this is the blueberry waffle stitch pattern here on the body. And as you can see, it's an incredibly stretchy pattern. So that's why I thought it would be really good for a gift, since I don't know her well. I know that her shoe size is an 8 wide. And so I wanted to do 64 stitches for the body after looking at projects of people who wear similar shoe sizes and looking at the little shoe size chart I have from Sensational Knitted Socks, I think, something like that. However, I wanted to make sure that the cuff was nice and stretchy because I know that she has curvy calves, and there's nothing worse than socks that cut into your calves. No fun at all. So instead of casting on 64 for the cuff, I cast on 68, but the blueberry waffle stitch feeds really nicely out of 2x2 rib, and so I didn't want to disrupt that since I would be decreasing once I started the body. So what I did So what I did was in the center back, instead of doing 2x2 rib, for 4 columns, I did 2x3 ribs. So there are 3 pearls instead of 2. And so then on the very last round of the ribbing, I could just decrease those pearl columns, do a pearl 2 together in each of the columns, and that way I'm not disrupting any of the ribbing going into the stitch pattern, but I get it nice and stretchy. So you can see that this, and I use the German twisted cast on, and I cast on very loosely. When you're doing the German twisted cast on, you can snug it up, or you can leave it a little more loose, and that affects how stretchy it is. So I left it loose this time. And you can see how stretchy the blueberry waffle stitch is by the fact that it stretches as much on 64 stitches as the 2x2 ribbing does on 68. So, yep. Other than that, I just did a standard heel. I like the, oh, I just forgot the name. It's the slip stitch heel flap, but it's, you alternate which stitches you're slipping. I'm sorry. Apparently, I'm going to be a little zoned out for this podcast. Let me see if chai helps my memory. Pigeon's eye? Partridge. Eye of partridge. There we go. Okay. So I like the eye of partridge one just because I think it's cute the way that it alternates. It creates a nice look. In the tweed, it pretty much got lost, so I think a regular slip stitch flap would have been just as useful. And just a regular gusset decrease. So the only other, I guess, process thing to talk about, Moth is back, is the embroidery. I used some leftover Knit Picks Felici that I have. The colorway I used to knit my aunt's socks has the black, and so I just cut the black out for the embroidery because my other black yarn was not superwash, and these are machine washable, so I didn't want her to suddenly have messed up faces. So as you can see, I opted to do 1 regular fox and 1 sleeping fox, and I really love how that turned out. I'm going to add a sleeping fox to the second of my own pair. And all I did, I tried to do some more elaborate embroidery stitches, but it just looked kind of awkward. So all I ended up doing was wrapping 3 stitches width, and I used the little peaks to center it. 3 stitches of width for, I think, about 3 rows. Yep, 3 rows on either side for the eye. And then for the nose, I started with 5 stitch width, and then I went down to 3, and then I went down to 1. And then I added 1 diagonal here and here just to make it look a little more triangular. So you can see this one's nose is higher up, but, you know, I don't think it really matters that much. So I did the same nose here. My camera is confused. It can't decide if it's a face or not. The low light, I'm sure, has a problem. And then for the closed eyes, I just did back stitch for the eyelids, and then I did little back stitches that they come over the eyelid line for the eyelashes. And I did have to have my hand inside like this the whole time that I was doing the embroidery because otherwise I kept catching the opposite side. So it was a little annoying. The other pair of socks I did, fox socks I knit them toe up, and it was much easier to embroider the face on the toe up sock because I stopped when it was about to here. So something to think about if you don't care which direction you're knitting socks in. And that is all I have to say with that. Okay. Next up, I will talk about my Phryne jumper, which I'm also knitting using a custom fit pattern. If you buy your first pattern within 30 days of signing up for an account, you get a free credit for another pattern. And her patterns are all written so that everything is knit flat and then seamed. And usually, even if I'm knitting the rest of the sweater flat, like this one, I knit the sleeves in the round and then just do the sleeve cap flat and seam it. But So anyway, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. But the yarn that I'm using for this is only 50% wool. The other 50% is alpaca and bamboo, which are quite drapey. So I thought that it would benefit from being entirely knit flat and seamed, even the sleeves. So that's why I decided to use my credit for this sweater. And the yarn is Canopy Fingering. It's a really lovely yarn, and I just love it. This is the Sarsaparilla colorway. So it's a deep brown with kind of purpley overtones. It's pretty accurate. And I finished the first sleeve. I also had to block this and make sure my gauge hadn't changed. Apparently I get really paranoid about gauge changes. So you can see the difference in the fabric between blocking and unblocking is kind of crazy. So this one seems a little stiff, and then this one is just all drape. So when I was knitting the gauge swatches, before I blocked it, I thought I was going to have to go up another needle to get the drape that I wanted. But once I blocked it, there was a big change. I'm not sure how well that's being conveyed there. But this is going to be another jumper, and it's self-designed, also inspired by the Miss Fisher, well, okay, by also inspired I mean my Miss Lemon jumper is named after Miss Lemon from the Poirot mystery series, and this one is named after the Honorable Phryne Fisher of Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, so I just thought that was a funny coincidence. And I am doing an eyelet pattern, but it's done a little differently than typical eyelets, and so it's called the Broderie Anglaise pattern. Am I showing you? No, I'm showing you the right side. And I really love how it's turning out. The project page has a link so that you can see how you do this, and I did change the spacing compared to that tutorial, and I include the details in the spacing. I want my fabric to not be see-through. I want to be able to wear this next to my skin without looking naked. So that's why I spread out the eyelets a bit more. I'm really in love with this. There's a lot of just plain stockinette, so I've been able to work on it even when I'm not feeling so well. I am knitting it English style instead of continental, and I cannot remember why I chose to do that, but I'm really enjoying it. Probably because of all the plain stockinette, and then these eyelet rows I find easier to do English style than continental. I think at this point I'm pretty much ambidextrous. I mean, there are certain kinds of stitches that I will only do continental, like anything ribbing. I did this ribbing continental. English style ribbing, I get very impatient. But then there are other things that I think that English style knitting just works better for. So, especially with all of the purling, I don't really, I'm not anti-purling in either method. I call myself purl agnostic, although of course if I'm working on garter stitch, I'm going to choose I'm going to choose to do it all knit, not all purl. But the way that I purl continental, my finger goes like this, and the way that I purl English style, it's exactly the same motion as when I'm knitting. And so I thought that it would be a bit less tiring to do this, although really it looks like both fingers move. I don't know. I just felt like knitting in English style, I guess. This is a very rambly episode. If you are a new viewer, I apologize. Usually I'm a bit more focused. This is what happens when I try to record when I'm not feeling great. But I think it's worth it to talk about the knitting. So as you can see, I am quite a bit of progress on the second sleeve. So that's how much further I have to go, and then I can cast on for the back. I would have expected to be further along in this project, but of course my illness stopped me from knitting for several days, and just various things have gotten in the way. But I'm hopeful. I want to finish it before I go home for Christmas, so we'll see. Just so that, it's off my list. I've been thinking a lot about the kinds of projects that I chose to knit this year and how I would change that for next year. So I'll be doing an episode about that come the new year. I realized that there were two other things I wanted to talk about with the Phryne sleeves. First, as I learned from my Miss Limone jumper, sometimes you have to choose between whether the pattern looks continuous at the seams or whether it's centered up the middle. And if it's centered up the middle, when you get to these decreases, they look symmetrical. If it's not centered up the middle, they don't look symmetrical. And I decided that having symmetrical decreases right here was more important than whether everything looked exactly the same along the bottom of my arm. So I went ahead and centered for these sleeves the eyelets. And then when I am increasing the sleeve, that does mean that sometimes there's more stitches between eyelets than there is on the rest of the pattern, and sometimes the eyelets are closer together. But, you know, you can't have it both ways, unfortunately, and I decided that the outside was more important. The other thing I wanted to talk about is basically how I make knitting easier on myself. So, and it just worked out really well. So the way that I spaced these, it's an 8-row repeat. So there are 4 rows of plain stockinette and then 4 rows of pattern. Well, 2 of them are pattern, the other 2 are wrong side rest rows. And so every time I pick up the sleeve, I knit 4 rows. And since I always stop in the same place, that makes it really easy for me to tell what I need to do for the next time that I pick it up. I always stop so that I'll be doing a wrong side row first, because all of the wrong side rows are rest rows, and so that way I've always got, you know, like I can just start purling and not have to think for a little bit. And then the way that I divided up the batches, I stop right after a pattern row. And I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get my camera to focus. Okay, yeah. So you see how right after you've done a pattern, that some of the stitches bunch up more together as opposed to just sitting loose. And so when I'm purling, I immediately can see that I have just done an eyelet row before that. And so that tells me that I just need to do 4 plain rows in stockinette. And on the other hand, if I pick it up and I do the purl row and it's just plain, there's no bunching at all, then I know that I need to do a pattern next. So that's how I kind of set my knitting up so that I don't have to count rows or anything like that. The knitting itself can tell me where I'm at. The other thing that I did was the pattern told me to increase every 8 rows, which worked out really well with my spacing. And so I just always increase on the first plain right side row after a pattern row. And the reason I did that is because as you're increasing, once you have enough stitches, you want to incorporate those into the eyelet pattern. And so if I do the increase on the first of the plain right side rows, that gives me 4 rows before I need to do an eyelet, so that stitch gets nice and well established, so that then when I incorporate it, it just goes a little more smoothly, as you can see. Maybe? Nope. But yeah, so, and then I don't count my increases anymore. I used to, like if it said increase 12 times or whatever, I would put 12 of the little coilless safety pins down on the cuff, and then I would safety pin each time to make sure that I had done them all. But now I just keep working until I have the right stitch count. That just seems easier to me, counting. I can't remember if every pattern gives you a final stitch count, but the custom fit patterns are really good about giving you lots of numbers as kind of mile markers along your pattern. I really enjoy following them for that reason. And so I know that I need to work until I have 88 stitches, so I don't need to count how many increases I've done. I just need to count how many stitches I've done. Of course, if I suddenly have an odd number, I know that I have forgotten to increase on one end, and so then I can just go ahead and sneak a new increase in on the next row and fix that. With this sleeve, I kept forgetting to do so you increase on a right side row, so you're always starting on this side and finishing on this side. So I never had a problem remembering the increases at the beginning, but occasionally I would forget them at the end. So I did put a safety pin locking coilless safety pin marker there just to remind myself to do that extra increase. But I have not had that problem on this sleeve, so just thought I'd mention that. I'm always fascinated by knitters who use row counters, you know, like the kind that you click. I'm terrible at using those because I don't remember to click at every row. And so then I can't trust them. And I'm like, how many rows did I forget to mark? I don't know. So I end up having to count on my knitting anyway. So I am not diligent enough to use a row counter. My final project is a very lovely, relaxing, simple one. I'm calling it my bonbon scarf. Because of the color and the texture, and it's just squishy gloriousness. Okay, so here is half of it. As you might be able to see, it is a garter stitch scarf. I've been knitting for over 3.5 years, and I have never knit a garter stitch scarf. So when I was a beginning knitter, I read a few things by experienced knitters talking about how boring acres of stockinette and garter were, and so I didn't do anything in plain stockinette or garter until I had already been knitting for over a year. I only did patterns because I was convinced I would be bored otherwise. So these days, I enjoy the relaxation of not having to worry about anything. I cast this on once I finished my dad's blanket so that I would have a worsted project because I find it's easier on my pain if I alternate needles and yarn. And this is based on a free pattern. It's Rilke's alpaca scarf. And I found this on Ravelry, and I bought the yarn specifically for this pattern because I really loved how her scarf looked, and I knew that alpaca just has this wonderful drape that you're not going to get with like a bouncy merino. And this was during Webb's summer sale, I think. And so this is Plymouth. It's the Plymouth brand, and it's their, or no, it's not, sorry, Aslan Trends. Yes, because it's like the lion in Narnia. And it's their royal alpaca yarn. I looked this up. Royal alpaca, like that phrase, is a way of indicating softness. So there's regular alpaca, then there's baby alpaca, then there's royal alpaca, and it depends on the micron count. Kind of the way you can have merino and then superfine merino. And this yarn, oh my gosh, it is like butter. It is so silky and soft and warm, and there's absolutely, I mean, it feels like silk. I am completely in love with it. So I ordered it in the petunia colorway, which was a purple. And when it arrived, it was more the kind of purple that you see in, you know those Easter eggs you can buy, the plastic ones that you put stuff in? Those kinds of colors. That's more the family that it was. It wasn't quite that bright, but it had that kind of intensity and clearness of color. And I think those colors are wonderful on other people, but they look terrible on me. And I knew, before I ordered it, looking at project pages, I knew it was probably going to be too clear of a color for me, but I also knew that I could over-dye it. So that's what I did. I went ahead, and in order to make a color more muted, you can dye it. I'm just trying to make sure you guys can see the tassel love here. Anyway, you can dye it with its complementary color, and that is complementary with 2 E's, not an I. So that's like a technical term, and it means the color that it's opposite of on the color wheel. So the opposite of purple is yellow. And I already had a little thing of Wilton's icing dye in one of their yellow shades. Sunflower maybe? Something like that. And so I had 2 skeins of this, 100 grams each, so 200 grams, and I put it in my really big pot with vinegar. And then I dissolved 1/8 of a teaspoon. I have these really random measuring spoons as a Christmas gift, in hot water in a measuring cup, and then I poured that in. And I like to pour the dye in because that leads to the kind of mottled effect, because where it touches the yarn first, more dye gets absorbed. So it creates that kind of kettle dye look really easily. It's a little, that's more accurate. So I went ahead and did that, and then when I was drying it, I realized I had used too much yellow and it looked gray. Now, I love gray. I mean, I am never opposed to gray, but I had wanted a purple scarf, so I was a little sad. I'm losing light quickly. I'll talk fast. This is the last thing I'm talking about. As I was saying, I was a little sad when I saw the color that it dried to, because it wasn't what I wanted it to look like. So I put it back in the stock pot, and this time I dissolved a packet of Kool-Aid grape, or grape-flavored Kool-Aid in my measuring cup, and I poured that back over the yarn, and that returned the purple. So now I have this really lovely mauve color that I am a big fan of this color. I think it's showing pretty accurately back here. It doesn't show accurately up front. So that is the Saga. Yeah, okay, so you can see that it's purple compared to like the quilt, which is more pink. Okay. So that is the Saga of the over-dyeing. The other thing I wanted to mention about dyeing is this is the first yarn that I dyed that wasn't superwash, and I almost felted it. If it had been wool instead of alpaca, I definitely would have felted it. And I've since over-dyed other plain wool yarn and not had any felting issues. So here are the two things that I did wrong that you should not do if you're dyeing regular wool, and that I probably shouldn't have been doing with the superwash wool, but I could get away with it. First of all, do not keep stirring your yarn. This is not a soup. It's not going to stick to the bottom of the pot. I just kept poking and stirring around, and that is, of course, agitation. The other major thing I did wrong was, so I put the yarn in the water, and then I brought it to a boil, so the temperature increase is gradual, so that was fine. But I dissolved the Wilton's icing, and the water was hot when I dissolved it. However, then I had to wait for the stock pot to heat up, which takes a really long time. So by the time I was ready to pour the dye over the yarn, that measuring cup of dye, the dye was no longer hot. And so when I poured it over the yarn, there was a very abrupt temperature change. And that is another thing that can cause felting. And so, yeah, don't do that. Just when I was, once the skeins had dried, I had to literally pull them apart strand by strand. There was quite a halo. But now it looks great. I mean, there's no permanent damage, thank goodness. And I think I mentioned I got these on sale, so they were only $10 a skein. Usually I think they're $20 a skein, which for the quality of the yarn I think is worth it. I don't know anything about how this yarn is manufactured. It's made in Peru, and I've talked before when I was talking about the Harriet alpaca yarn that I am pro alpaca yarn being manufactured in the Andes, and that Peru generally seems to have decent labor standards, but I don't know for sure. Okay, so as I said, this is a free pattern. It's really simple. You start off with 3 stitches and then you just increase every other row. Because it's garter stitched, I did have a stitch marker on the right side so that I knew where to be increasing. In the pattern, she said that she uses backward loop increases, but that would require me to let go of the yarn every time. So I just did knit 1 front back as increases, because in garter stitch, those are really not visible at all, the way that in stockinette, it creates that bump. And that just seemed like the simplest option for increasing. And then once you get to your desired width, then you just knit straight. And I decided, since I had 2 skeins of yarn, to knit it in 2 halves, and I'm going to graft it. So this is the second half. And here's my little right side row marker. As you can see, the tassel makes a really big difference. And the tassel is part of the pattern. Look how much better that looks. I'm very excited to have a scarf with tassels on it. I don't think my scarf is going to be as long. So the pattern writer, she used the same amount of yarn as I did, 200 grams of worsted weight alpaca, and her scarf ended up being 12 inches by 72 inches. And right now, I think my width is closer to 11 inches, and then my scarf is going to be more, 72 inches is 6 feet, and I think mine is going to be more like 5-something feet. Although, I don't know, this is looking longer, so maybe I'm wrong. But either way, I know it'll be long enough to loop once, and I think that with worsted weight, because it folds over, you really don't need to have to loop it twice, so I'm really happy, because this is half, so the second half is going to complete the loop, if that makes sense. I'm a total convert to worsted weight scarves, and I love garter stitch. I haven't used garter stitch in that many projects, but the projects that I do use it in end up becoming favorites. There's just something about the squishiness, and especially really nice alpaca yarn in garter stitch. It's silky and squishy, and I mean, this scarf just feels like the height of luxury to me. I love knitting on it, the color and the texture. That's why I called it the bonbon scarf, because it just feels like some kind of decadent dessert knitting. I think I've got about half a skein left, I'm not sure, on this one. And I got really lucky in that they seem to match, because obviously I didn't alternate yarn. I mean, I had them both in the sock pot at once, but I know that with hand-dyed yarn, they usually recommend that you alternate the skeins, but I don't think there's going to be a line. And all I did, as far as making sure I wouldn't run out of yarn, I did not do the tassel ahead of time. Instead, once I saw that my yarn cake was getting pretty small and that I didn't have that much left, I stopped and I made the tassel from the other end of the cake. And I didn't cut it yet, but you know, I wrapped enough around an index card that it looked like a nice thick tassel, because you don't want a puny tassel, you know, that's not going to feel like decadence. And then I kept knitting until I got to the final round, and you want to end, in order to graft in garter stitch, you want to be grafting 2 purl rows together, because the grafting is going to create a knit row. Does that make sense? So I ended with a purl bump on the right side row, and then I left enough yarn to weave it, or to weave in the end. I decided that I would use the other skein for the grafting. And so I cut that, and then I wrapped those few extra inches into the tassel. And then I just went ahead and used the end from my cast on edge to tie the tassel on. So saved me an end to weave in, and I think it worked really well. I haven't trimmed the bottom of the tassel yet because I want the tassels to be even. And so I'm going to wait until I have 2 tassels to trim them. But yeah, if you are looking for just a simple, relaxing, decadent project, I really enjoy this. I was really surprised that the increases are only on one side, that they're not symmetrical, because you know me, I'm a symmetry person. I always do mirrored increases and decreases. But I decided to just follow the pattern because I really liked how her scarf looked. And once you're wearing it, I think it kind of curves a little. I don't know if folds. I'm not sure what I'm going with this. But my point is, I think it looks perfectly fine the way it is, instead of being an even triangle. See, it's more of a right triangle, and I think that looks perfectly fine as worn. The one thing that I did do, because I'm me, is I increased on the other side. So on this one I increased after the first stitch, and on this one I increased right before the final stitch, so that they will mirror each other when I graft them, so that, you know, with the right sides, even though it's garter stitch, with the increases, I thought that might change the right and back a little, and so they will mirror each other that way. And that was really a very simple change, especially when you're just doing knit one front back for the increases. So yeah, I am absolutely in love with this project. I'm really enjoying making it, and I can't wait to wear the finished scarf. And yeah, projects like this and my Phryne jumper, which has a lot of stockinette, are also making me think hard about how ornate I want to make a lot of my knitwear in the future, but that is also something for another podcast episode. So I will let you all go now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Oh, I forgot to say I'm wearing my Melusine cardigan. In case you're curious, it's self-designed with twisted stitches out of Quince & Company Turn Yarn. You can find the details on my project page. In this type of episode, I don't write project notes, but I do write down details on my project pages on Ravelry, so you can always find out details about any modifications I've done, stitch patterns, all of that. Yarn usage, I weigh all my yarn to see how much it took. And yeah, I will see you hopefully very soon so that I can get back on schedule. And as always, thank you for watching. Bye.